Okay, so I'm going to try and do a brief Chapter 7 overview. All right, so first we have to understand this kind of biological definitions that we have and the cultural understandings that come from those definitions. So sex is the biological distinction between females and males. So there's this idea that it's a binary, right? You are this or that. But in biological reality, there's actually a spectrum, right? As there are many people who are born intersexed, meaning that they have some sort of mixed sex criteria that distinguishes them from either male or female. So even like we talked about gender before being socially constructed around this idea of a binary, but even biological sex, something we consider to be scientific, is still being affected by this binary idea of gender. Okay, so primary sex characteristics refer to differences in genitalia. Typically, this is this idea of like what equipment you have when you were born. And then secondary sex characteristics refer to the distinct physical characteristics that develop as we mature. So, meaning when you hit puberty, the kind of physical distinction that happens at that point, right? Before we hit puberty and get those secondary sex characteristics, we're quite similar physically, of course, to a point. But it's once we hit that point that, the shapes of our faces tend to change, the tones of our voices. Obviously, women develop breasts, men develop facial hair, all this kind of fun stuff. So, that's kind of the way that we understand the the maturation of the biological sex. But what again is interesting to note is that we see it as a fact, but at the same time, we often exclude the intersexed who, unfortunately, because of that reality, a lot of them undergo unnecessary surgeries in order to fit them into a biological distinction of male or female. Because, again, on a birth certificate, there is no other box, right? It's just male or female. What's the first question someone asks when you're born? Is it a boy or a girl? So for those, it's actually more common than Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, though we've heard of Down syndrome and cerebral palsy. Um, but again, it goes against our fundamental ideas about those binaries in society. And there's so much of our culture that rests on this idea of you're this or you're that. It tends to destabilize all of that when you acknowledge, well, there's more than just this or that. So again, sociologists point out that sexual activity itself is also guided by human culture. So, cultural norms often are what define who we can have sex with. So, meaning that typically in this way we have like an age, so meaning like an age of consent, meaning by law, it'll define what age a person can consent to sexual activity. In the United States, it's 18, but it is younger in other countries. So, again, it's kind of a social understanding. Cultural norms like marital status, right? So it's socially discouraged to date someone who's married, unless you're a homewrecker, right? No, I'm just kidding. Right? But again, that means our culture has a distinction between who should be having sex with whom. Also, the biological sex of our partners, right? So we construct heterosexuality as normative and natural, and we construct any different expressions of sexuality as wrong, right? And then people even say, oh, that's not natural. And you're like, really? If it's not natural, then why does it happen in nature? Because that's kind of the definition of natural. Anyway, so when cultural norms really kind of define what's viewed as normative sexual activity, and people that differ from that are considered deviant and they are punished. So when it comes to sexual attitudes in the US, there are certain factors that led to increased sexual freedom in the US over time. So, first, advances in technology led to more control over reproduction. So, the birth control pill, later the IUD, these made controlling pregnancies easy and possible for women. So, obviously, that led to a greater ability for women to enter the workforce, to enter education fields, to gain careers and footholds outside of the home. And, you know, it's kind of unfortunately still controversial to this day, which we'll talk about in a minute. Um, Also, there's this kind of flux that happens when people migrate to the cities during the industrial era. So moving from rural communities into larger towns meant that more people had contact with other people than ever before. So people moved to where the jobs were, and this large economic shift led to more sexual freedoms and such as courting and dating rituals. So what's interesting is before this time period, it was normative for a woman to ask a man out, right? So she would, if she admired a gentleman, she would invite him over to her house, and they would like light a candle, and by the time the candle burned down, that's like how long they could talk for their date, right? Super exciting. Under the watchful eye of her family to make sure that she was chaste and pure. So it was, of course, it made sense for a woman to ask a man out because a guy's not going to be like, hey, let me come to your house for dinner, right? It's just kind of bizarre, like the power dynamic situation there. So when people moved during the industrial era to the cities, there's also came in, you know, at the same time period as automobiles becoming a popular mode of transportation for many people. So as a result of industrial, economies. So people were now able to kind of travel around in cars, and you started seeing like, uh, why am I blanking on the name of that right now? The kind of like overlook points where, young people would go to make out or have sex or whatever. And this also kind of changed the dynamic of how dating worked. So instead of it being under the watchful eye of your parents, it was often men would take women out on a date, kind of in the model that we think of today, where a guy would ask a girl out, and the same thing, think about the power dynamic, right? A girl isn't going to be like, hey, you should buy me dinner. It's awkward in that kind of sense. So then it became the custom for men to ask women out instead of the other way around. So, this kind of started this idea that men pay for dates, right? And why was that? Well, because it came about in the cultural relevance of this time period, right? Where women, even if they're working in factories and getting wages, which they largely, weren't as much as men, the wages that they got were, severely lower. They often were controlled by their fathers. So, they didn't really have much control over their money. So, of course, it would make sense for men to pay for food or dates or dancing or whatever it would be because they're the ones who actually had money. So it's interesting, we still have these kind of cultural value systems sometimes that people say, oh, someone's chivalrous if they pay or something of that nature, though we do still have a pay gap. So if anything, women should only have to pay like, 70 whatever percent, depending on how much they're being paid. No, but this idea that this switch between what the customs were was completely related just to a change in the economy. It changed the way that people congregated, the way that people met and fell in love. So it changed dating rituals. And then, of course, Kinsey's research in the 1940s and 50s is fascinating. He's known for his controversial report on sexuality in American society, which there's a picture of here at the bottom of some people reading it. So he did the most comprehensive sexual research study of his time. And he used this scale that they later termed the Kinsey scale to measure sexual desire. Instead of this idea of a heterosexual or homosexual dichotomy, he asked people to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 6 between heterosexuality and homosexuality. And what he found, interestingly enough, was that the majority of people did not rate themselves as completely heterosexual or completely homosexual, which was kind of the cultural conception of that. Most people fell somewhere along this continuum, right? Where maybe they didn't actually have sexual contact with someone of the same sex, but they had had a fantasy or they had had, some sort of interest or something of that nature, right? So this idea kind of emerged that sexuality is much more on a continuum when it comes to understandings of our actual internal desires than it is this dichotomy. The dichotomy is something that's placed on us by the culture to say, just to kind of label and understand and segregate us as this or that. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. So, of course, this kind of takes another turn. In the 1970s, you have the feminist movement coming in and really, trying to change perceptions of sexuality to, really emphasize the perspectives and roles and social understandings of women. So, of course, they had a specific view of sex as men's power over women. They wanted to liberate women from sexuality that was only for the service of men. right? So it wasn't about not having sex, it was about a woman having consent in that sexuality, right? So part of this was, um, like before this term, this time period, there wasn't really a social conception of marital rape, right? If you didn't want to have sex with your husband, but he wanted to have sex, you had to have sex with him, right? It was this kind of a cultural understanding of that's part of your wifely duties. So of course, if a woman was facing this kind of, what they often call within IPV intimate terrorism, then she had very little recourse if there's no laws against it, right? So the social understandings of sexuality were that women were just passive in the role of sexuality. They didn't really have their own sexuality. They were just put there for men to have sex with, right? And that you had kind of had to like convince a woman to have sex versus a man always wanted to have sex. And we don't understand how this is really just our social script more than that's an actual biological reality. So feminists were saying no, that women should have their own sexuality that's free from this kind of patriarchal hierarchy of men dominating women. So, again, we have those social scripts that say men are supposed to be aggressive, women are supposed to be passive, and that's how we construct our understandings of sexuality. So, we can kind of just understand that by saying, if you look at what we call a man who has a lot of sex, typically, I mean, there's a couple now, like in the millennial generation, there's a couple new terms that are interesting that kind of fly in the face of this, but typically it's something that's praised, right? He's a stud, you know, those kind of things that like, it's positive for him to have a lot of sex. If a woman has a lot of sex, we have words for that too, right? And those words don't have the same meanings. So feminists are really pointing out that and kind of saying, if we see a woman as sexually forward, she's vilified. But if a man has a lot of sex, we glorify him. So that's what they call the sexual double standard. Plus, if sex is constructed as men's pleasure, then regardless of whether or not a female is enjoying it, it's still considered a matter of dominance, right? And that's a problem when it should be something that every person can own of their own, is their own sexuality. It shouldn't be something that's manipulated or controlled or dominated by anyone but that person's internal sense of, desire. So they really kind of brought about this idea of sexism as a social problem, meaning that there was a systematic nature in society where women are not given the same opportunities and resources as men. So they stood up against pornography, rape, incest, and they demanded access to birth control and abortion in an effort to give women some freedom over their family planning and their sexual lives. But this did take a cultural turn backwards in the 1980s in kind of almost an irreparable way, where conservatives tried to, they had their own counter revolution to the sexual revolution that happened in the late 60s and early 70s. They had this motto of a return to family values. And there's a very specific family that's being promoted there, right? It's a white, affluent, religious, heterosexual family, right? So then how does that reflect the actual United States? Yeah. Okay, so this is an interesting, I like that your book goes there. So men and women who began the sexual revolution in the 60s are carrying the movement into old age. So those baby boomers, they were the generation that was born as a result of people coming back from World War II. They are now aging into retirement themselves, 10,000 a day. So, they don't really take to the social script of this idea that old people don't have sex, right? We like to think of it that way because in our social culture and the media and everything, we have these kind of images that only the young and beautiful have sex, have a sexuality. Everyone else is just gross and should go away. But, if you think about your own desire as you age through the life course, right? It's not as if you're going to get to a certain point and just be like, no, I don't feel like having sex anymore, right? Of course, your desire hormonally changes as you age, but the idea that people just don't want to have sex after age whatever you socially consider to be gross is just not true, right? Your parents, your grandparents, they probably have sex. And that's something you kind of have to accept because eventually you will be that age and you're not going to be like, oh, I don't want to do this because young people think it's gross, right? Anyway, so when it comes to people aged 65 to 74, those reporting a current sexual partner, 85% of men and 62% of women meaning those women are getting some action, as there tends to be less older, women tend to live longer than men. So there tends to be a higher population of women. And then age 75 to 84, 78% of men are still having sex and 41% of women. So if you think about that, people that are age 75 to 84, they're not people that we consider to be sexual, but that doesn't mean that they're not. It just means that as a culture, we have very clear distinctions about there being an age that's too young and an age that's too old, right? Whether or not that's actually how sexuality develops. So, for example, $20 million are spent on erectile dysfunction prescriptions per year, and $1.5 billion to drug companies overall. So these things like Cialis, Viagra, whatever, are selling at an amazing rate because people still desire to have sex up until their later years. Okay, when it comes to sexual orientation, that is an individual's romantic and emotional attraction to another person. So this can include partners of the same sex, such as homosexuality, the opposite sex, such as heterosexuality in a binary, either sex, such as bisexuality, or neither, such as asexuality. Or, of course, we'll talk about, too, in a bit how these kind of orientation breakdowns are now developing changes to them, as well as more people are identifying as either trans or non-binary. Then have people that are like polyamorous, that it's kind of like bisexuality, only you are attracted to people of all representations and not just people that are considered cisgendered male and cisgendered female, right? So these things really change over time, and it's really interesting to see how this kind of development is going on right now, which also reminds me, I just need to update my textbook. Okay, so I'm going to show you a brief video clip right here to kind of talk about some of this.
Gender and sexuality is a complicated subject. The concept of males and females, homosexuals and heterosexuals, even bisexuals are common, but few people know that there's a much broader spectrum. Because of a lack of information, many teens have a hard time figuring out their sexual and gender identity. Without a proper education, they can struggle with their identity well into adulthood and even their whole life. Sexualities. Most people know that heterosexuality means to feel sexual attraction to people of the opposite sex. Homosexuality means to feel attraction to people of the same sex, and bisexuality is experiencing sexual attraction to both males and females. But there's more. Pansexual people, also known as omnisexual, can experience attraction to all sexes and gender identities. An asexual person is someone that doesn't experience sexual attraction to any sex or gender at all. However, this doesn't mean that they aren't open to or can't experience romantic attraction. Romantic attraction is a feeling that causes people to desire a romantic relationship with a specific other person that doesn't necessarily involve sex. Heteroromantic, homoromantic, biromantic, panromantic, and aromantic are all types of romantic attraction. And these can be mixed to fit with other types of sexual attraction. An example of this is bisexual and homoromantic. Gender. There's more than just male and female in the gender spectrum. Intersex is when a person is born with both male and female parts, usually having an XXY chromosome. They can choose which gender they would like to be identified as, or they can identify as neither. Non-binary is when a person chooses to identify as neither male nor female, usually taking on different pronouns like she, her, jim, or z, zer, zim. Gender fluid can also fit into the spectrum of gender identities. A person who is gender fluid changes their gender identity that best fits with how they're feeling, changing from male to female to neither. Being cisgendered means you identify as the sex you were born as. Females identify as females, and males identify as males. Transgender and transsexual people identify as a gender different from the biological sex they were born with. So a person born as a female may identify as a male later in life, and vice versa. While the two terms can be used interchangeably, transsexual usually refers to someone who has changed their appearance and undergone a sex change, while a person who identifies as transgender usually changes their appearance only. This is not to be confused with drag, which is a performance art. How-tos. Sexuality is loose, and labels like these are here to help people feel comfortable or like they have a place to belong. An important tip to remember is if you aren't sure how a person identifies, just ask. Appropriate pronouns are important to everyone. If you aren't sure, a safe way to go is using them, they pronouns. Say you have a friend or know someone that falls under one of these sexualities or gender identities and you aren't sure how to treat them. One easy way to respect someone's sexuality and gender is to never assume anything. Just because someone who identifies as bisexual is dating someone of the opposite sex, that doesn't mean they're suddenly straight. This applies to every sexuality. Help and information. It's common for people to have a hard time figuring out who they are. If you're in a situation like this, that's okay. Getting love and support from your friends and family is one of the most important things about finding yourself and your identity. Counseling is another option if you're having trouble. Online support groups can help you connect to other people who are dealing with similar challenges. If you still find yourself in a slump, eating right, exercising, and doing things that make you happy can help you through your confusion. For some counseling, you can call the GLBT National Hotline. They'll be more than happy to help.
Okay, so how someone defines homosexual orientation affects the share of the population that are considered to be a homosexual. So, meaning it depends on how you define it. If you define homosexuality as any act ever, then we see high incidence or at least reporting of homosexuality. But if we define homosexuality as someone that identifies as homosexual or identifies as bisexual, then you see a much smaller presence. So over here in the chart, right? So for women or for men reporting any activity whatsoever, and for those actually having an identity, it's much lower. So those things are distinct. So when it comes to understandings of homosexuality, there's clearly a long history of prejudice and discrimination. So, how this has really changed over time. Obviously, there's been a major shift in public opinion. So fewer than half of US adults now say that same-sex marriage relations are wrong. Laws now ban discrimination based on sexual orientation all across the United States. In 2011, the US military ended its ban on same-sex behavior, or what they called don't ask, don't tell, which allowed people to serve in the military if they were homosexual, only if they did never disclosed their sexuality, which is a ridiculous thing to ask someone to live in a closet. And in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of marriage equality across 50 states. So that's a huge shift in public opinion, especially in recent years, hence why we're also starting to see a backlash to that in the Trump years. So obviously hostility and prejudice still exist. So many religious organizations refuse to ordain gay men or lesbians. A third of homosexual college students report experiencing harassment. There's also a lot of harassment and intimidation that happens within the world of work, right? A lot of discrimination there. When it comes to hate crimes, there were over 1,300 hate crimes against homosexuals in 2012. So this is still a very prevalent problem as, a marginalized group. People are often targeted for violence, and that's something that you'll see in the film that we're watching in class, Stonewall Uprising, and how normal that was within the culture, that it was more normative for police to use that kind of force. So of course that just justifies that to other people in society when someone in legitimate authority is doing something like that, right? And then of course, when it comes to this kind of multiplicities of experience, people of color that are homosexual are especially likely to experience violence. And also, for example, right now, trans people, like trans women of color, are at, a lot of women this year have already died, which is incredible that, as such a small percentage within the population, to have that many deaths represented specifically because they were trans women of color, and people had a problem with their identity and murdered them as a result. It's a really startling issue and a problem for people in these small communities that it's very hard for them to feel safe. So, what determines sexual orientation? So, there are obviously some cultural factors, right? The diversity of sexual expression around the world suggests there's a cultural influence. So, the way that we understand sexuality, so for example, I teach sexuality as a Constance Fullerton, and we talk about how in other places around the world, there are other things that we would consider same sex sexuality, but they're not considered homosexuality because that is a social, cultural definition of our culture that actually comes from the 1800s, the late 1800s, the 1880s. So for those people that say, oh, in the Bible it says, that homosexuality is a sin. Actually, if anything, it says that same sex sexuality within the kind of context of maybe like Egypt or Rome, but not in the context of what we're talking about, right? Within our culture, because how the hell could something have been talking about it before it had a cultural definition, right? It just means that we've translated a book like, over a dozen times from different languages that have different cultural meanings in each language. And that kind of gets filtered through that, and then people use that as a justification for denying people rights, which is sad. So anyway, obviously our culture has a huge part of how we understand what is normal and what is not normal. And so patterns of socialization have a huge impact in the fact that, religion is a huge cultural factor in understanding what's considered right and wrong. Of course, there's biological factors. So lots of research looks at how sexual orientation is largely fixed at birth, right? So people say, oh, it's a choice. Why are you choosing to be gay? But, for many, they grow into their sexual identity and they feel that that is something that has always inherently been within them, that is not something that somehow they just decided, you know what, I think I'll face discrimination and choose to do this, right? So studies on genes and hormones and epigenetic research where they look at, different genes and kind of those things to figure out what they consider to be causing homosexuality. But in the same kind of, see, here's the part that's really messed up about this. It's not necessarily just to understand. A lot of the motivation and the funding behind this research is really disgusting. It's this idea that if you could figure out where on your, genome that a likelihood of homosexuality exists, that you could either give a parent an opportunity to, like, in utero, hey, your kid could either have Down syndrome, this, or homosexuality. And then they can choose whether or not to continue with the pregnancy. Or, this idea that you could kind of weed out homosexuality from the population if you could get rid of it in the gene pool. So again, when you look at genetics, it kind of gets very kind of wrapped up in this eugenicist idea of like who is the best, what should be the best, what should be right and wrong. And of course, that's culturally defined, right? So that really comes from our own cultural understandings. And those marginalized people are not going to be the ones that have the shape of, what's considered right. So for example, obviously the eugenicist values of Hitler, right, that led him to say that people like him were the dominant race, right? That kind of thing. Obviously, we have our own prejudices and our own perspectives, and that kind of what leads our understandings of science itself. So it's really important that if people are trying to understand it, they're trying to do it from a place of scientific understanding and not from a place of trying to somehow medically erase whole groups of people, which is insane. So I'm going to show you this video really quick that kind of talks about some of the different understandings about how this works, as there isn't, exact consensus.
When people talk about homosexuality, they often ask, is it a choice?
I heard it is.
Hello, what's your name?
Christian.
Well, Christian, let's see what the latest science has to say.
Oh, that.
To help us, here are two gay people, George and Martha. Before we can answer, is it a choice, we must first determine what it means to be gay. How do you know you're a homosexual?
The same way you know that you're straight.
Since the 19th century, many theories about homosexuality have been offered that are untestable and contradictory.
Male homosexuality is the result of an absent father and an overbearing mother. See ya.
Stand up straight, dear.
And the female homosexual has never recovered from her anger over not having the penis. She wishes to avenge her perceived castration by taking another female as her sexual object.
You're kidding me, right?
Well, I've always been told that homosexuality is unnatural.
Is it? In fact, homosexual relations are common in nature, including zebras, baboons, dolphins, sheep, buffalo, ducks, foxes, elephants, horses, gorillas, moose, house cats, pigs, mice, rabbits, swans, and lions, to name a few.
Well, okay, but we're not animals. Human beings have free will.
You don't just decide who to love.
Settle down there, Martha. Christian does have a point, but let's take a look at the most recent scientific evidence. As they study sexual orientation, scientists are currently looking at three main areas: genes, hormones, and birth order. Of course, most of these studies focus only on male sexuality. Sorry, Martha.
What a shock.
Let's first look at studies of identical twins.
Hi.
When one identical twin is a gay man, the other twin is gay up to 70% of the time, far higher than would occur if genes played no role. In fact, these studies show that genes play a greater role in determining sexual orientation than they do in whether or not you're right or left-handed. And we don't punish the left-handed. Well, not anymore.
Let's get it!
Scientists have recently noticed a striking statistical phenomenon. Studies show that having older brothers increases the odds of a boy being homosexual.
Moms always baby the youngest, making them gay.
No, that's not it. When a woman is pregnant with a boy, scientists are realizing that her female body often sees the male fetus as a foreign object and begins to produce antibodies against it. The more boys a woman has, the more adept her body becomes at feminizing the fetus, which may explain why with every successive boy, the odds that he will be gay go up significantly.
All right, maybe you all accept it, but what about those people who started out gay and say they became straight by discovering God? What about ex-gay ministries?
Even so-called ex-gay ministries don't claim to change a person's inner sexual desires, just his or her sexual conduct.
We're still gay.
If these places really work, why don't they all use the same technique? Why does each ministry experiment its own way?
Well,
And why have so many members and leaders recanted earlier claims that they were changed?
maybe these programs don't work for everyone, but what's the harm?
How about the feelings of shame and guilt they instill and reinforce in their victims? Or the money, energy, and time they sap from people who have nothing wrong with them?
Says you.
Well, in point of fact, not just George says that, Christian. The American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Psychoanalytic Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the National Association of Social Workers have all stated that homosexuality should not be treated as a mental disorder, and that they oppose attempts at reparative or conversion therapy, and that sexual orientation is not a choice and cannot be changed.
So that's it. I'm supposed to believe that it's not a choice just because all those doctors and scientists say so?
Or you could just ask us.
I do know this one girl named Heather who goes back and forth, but she's
Shut up.
The information in this educational cartoon is based upon studies that can be found in any university library, with the possible exception of the Bob Jones University in South Carolina.
So, this understanding of what if, do we socially accept people based on their sexual orientation? You can see on this chart, obviously attitudes have changed dramatically, but at the same time, you still have about 40% listed here in like 2013. So that's a problem. But, this again study, what about sexual relations between two adults of the same sex? Do you think it's always wrong, almost always wrong only sometimes, or not wrong at all, right? And for those that said it was always wrong or almost always wrong, that percentage rate, obviously you see that it actually goes up from the 1970s, right? So you have it go down a little bit in the 70s when the gay rights movement is happening, like right here. And then you see this uptick in the 80s and kind of a peak in that late 80s time period when this is the Reagan/Bush era, where this kind of social understanding of family values and those kind of things were pushed very hard in the mainstream media. So you see that kind of dip in attitude. And then when, kind of those, the Clinton era comes in, you have the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which basically says, okay, it's still discriminatory and awful, but it actually says that people should be allowed to serve in the military if they're homosexual. And there was kind of loosening of policies and restrictions, and you see the kind of public sentiment change as a result. So obviously, social movements have been working for a long time to make this happen. And those attitudes have changed, and so that's going to affect what policies we have. Also, in the book they talk about how, in 1973, when this study is basically starting here, the American Psychiatric Association first removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders, the DSM. And, you have, in 2003, legally, the Supreme Court striking down Texas's laws, those sodomy laws that basically were put in place to specifically target homosexual communities, as being, unconstitutional. And so it's really interesting seeing how, this has really changed 1975 to, recently. Okay, so when it comes to same-sex marriage, in 2004, Supreme Court of Massachusetts ruled that gay men and lesbian women had the right to marry. And it's, interesting that by 2015, same-sex marriage has become legal across the United States. Like I mentioned before, I teach sexualities, and before that it was very difficult because trying to remember which state, and each year some, in piecemeal, a few states here and there voted themselves to kind of make this an issue. I mean, obviously in California we had Prop 8 that was trying to ban same-sex marriage. It passed. It was challenged because of the kind of nature of, again, making a law that says people can't have rights goes against the kind of fundamental rights that people have, so that's kind of how that ended up being legislated, and it made same-sex marriage legal within California. So it's interesting, in your book they talk about how there are 18 countries in the world where same-sex marriage is legal, but that number has moved to 23. Again, I need to update the book, but I want to keep it cheaper for you guys. So I just try and update the info as we go. So, this is obviously something that's still pretty dynamic and changing as we go. So it's something that, as cultures tend to have a softer approach or understanding, then legislation follows. So the gay rights movement gained public attention. Basically starting back in the 50s, you had people really trying to say that they needed, support and rights, and not to be vilified and targeted as deviants and repressed socially. Before that point, the kind of discrimination and harassment that people faced was severe. Like if you were, either charged or thought to be engaging in any sort of act like what they considered sodomy. See, sodomy itself is really actually any non-procreative sexual act, but that was used as a shield to target specifically homosexual communities. That's why we think of anal sex when we think of sodomy, even though that's not what sodomy actually means. It means any non-procreative sexual act. And when those laws were first enacted, that meant towards anyone, even people that were married were supposedly subject to that law. But it's not as if they went like to people in their homes, in their bedrooms, and like arrested them for having non-procreative sex. It was just a way to not look like they're discriminating, but just target one group of people. So, the movement kind of started with people dressing up in suits and trying to act, what was considered proper to the dominant society, and try and like push for rights. But this took a kind of strong turn after the Stonewall riot, or what we will watch in class, the Stonewall Uprising, that happened in 1969, which was a defining moment in growth of the movement. And really, again, the film really gets into it, but it was a galvanizing moment that turned this whole movement on its head and kind of said, before this, there was no being out. This idea that we typically have of people that are out of the closet. There was no being out, right, at that point. It was illegal. So this kind of, the way that you make an act illegal and then you can make the person illegal was a stigma that a lot of people faced. So yeah, they really get into it in the film, and it's very interesting hearing from the perspectives of people that were young and their identity formation experiences in a time period of that kind of repression. So, as a result of this movement, there was the introduction of the term homophobia, right? That just means an aversion to or hostility towards people thought to be gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So claiming that there was an intolerance that was going on of sexual orientation, and then that itself is a social problem. So our more modern kind of movement that's happening right now in social understandings is towards those who are transgender. So transgender refers to appearing or behaving in ways that challenge how females and males should look and act according to our kind of social definitions and norms. So, again, it's not the same as sexual orientation. Your gender and your sex are two different things, right? Your sexual orientation is more of like who you desire sexually. Your gender identity is your internalized sense of who you are along this gendered spectrum of, representation. So this again kind of becomes an issue when we like to have a binary, and those people that we consider to deviate from it, we punish and repress. A lot of people argue that the rights within same-sex marriage and things of that nature, now a lot of the focus of those groups that opposed same-sex marriage and equal rights for same-sex communities are now turning their focus on transgender people because they are even more marginalized, and focusing on making laws to try to repress them. So for example, the picture here on the bottom right is a trans man who posted this picture as, just to kind of explain to people how ridiculous the bathroom laws are when it comes to practical living, right? Living in a gender, we don't actually know what someone's biological sex characteristics are unless they take off their clothes, right? And in our cultural norms, people wear clothes, right? So you don't really know what someone's equipment is. You just know what their gender expression is. And that's kind of the whole point, is we should respect that, because it's really none of my business what's, under someone's pants unless they want it to be my business. So it's something that we should just treat people with respect regardless of their expression. But we have these kind of repressive laws popping up that say that you have to use the bathroom that goes along with your biological sex criteria of birth. So for someone like the man in the picture here, who was born biologically female but has lived as a man, if he walks into a women's bathroom, that's going to be very deviant, right? It's something that we're going to consider as, what? Why is he going in a woman's bathroom, right? And again, it's something that doesn't at all harm anyone if he's able to just use the bathroom that corresponds to his gender identity, and not, one that corresponds to his biological classification at birth. So it's just a ridiculous issue. Again, I mean, we had segregated bathrooms for race before, and those things were ridiculous as well. So obviously, this kind of bathroom restriction of who can use what and who's allowed to be there, I think the saddest part is that they're using this paternalizing sexist logic, this benevolent sexism, that women need to be protected. So a lot of these laws are saying, do you want an adult man walking into a bathroom with your daughter, with your wife? But it's not an adult man walking in the bathroom. It is a trans woman, right? Someone who lives as a woman who just wants to use the bathroom, right? And so when it comes to the actual scapegoating and fear and all of this hyped up crap about bathrooms right now, there's very few when it comes to actual, like, how many times has that happened, right? If that was actually something that was happening, that people would create legislation based on it, right? So how many times have women been victimized as the result of a trans woman going to a bathroom? 0 times, right? But how many times have trans women who are then forced to go into a male bathroom themselves been assaulted, it's, that's a whole different number. So that's the problem, is that you're actually just putting trans women at risk instead of, just respecting someone's gender identity and letting them use the bathroom, right? We are conflating some sort of sexual predation or deviance with someone's gender expression. Just like in the, something I talk about in my sexualities class at Casa Fullerton, back in the days, how we portrayed homosexuality was the same kind of thing, that it wasn't two same-sex people consenting in an adult relationship with each other. It was an old man predating on a young boy and picking them up at parks or things like that, and it wasn't consensual, right? That was the same kind of thing then. That's why they didn't allow people that were homosexual to teach, because they thought they were just sexual deviants, these kind of things that are just insane, right? So some of these attitudes and notions have changed, but these understandings and cultural problems people have about transgender people are sadly just beginning. So I'm going to show you a clip about this kind of bathroom situation as well.
Trump administration withdrawing a pledge of support that President Obama made to transgender students, withdrawing guidance that the Obama administration had sent to public schools on the use of bathrooms by transgender students. CNN's Jeff Zeleny is at the White House, joins us with the latest. So first of all, explain what this is and what this isn't. It's not an executive order. It's essentially withdrawing guidance in a letter put out from the Obama administration.
Exactly, Anderson. It essentially is just sort of directing schools across the country to rescind and take back what President Obama said last year to provide special protections for transgendered students in restrooms and other things. This essentially is a federal government saying that it's up to individual schools, individual states to make these own protections. So it's not an executive order at all. This is coming out tonight from the Department of Justice and the Department of Education in a joint statement saying that they basically are sending the directive back to the states to make these own decisions, Anderson.
So when it comes to other countries, unfortunately, we lag behind the rest of the world when it comes to offering rights and protections for trans people. So there are other places that do have better laws. So I'm going to show you a little clip about that really quick, just to give you a basic understanding of what the standing is right now. So when it comes to pornography, those are words or images intended to cause sexual arousal. So there's differing opinions as to what community standards of decency should be when it comes to pornography. So conservatives view pornography as a social problem because it threatens conventional morality, right? It basically promotes men, masturbating instead of trying to form healthy human adult relationships with women, right? It kind of deters from this, more patriarchal notion of what dating and relationships should be, right? And liberals really see it as, something that often needs to, or some of them defend it as a freedom of expression thing, right? As a way to say, you can't really tell people what they can and can't watch. And others really support, again, that right to privacy when it comes to this, but they do object to pornography as it is demeaning to women in a lot of ways. So one of the stats I put here for you, 88% of scenes in top rented and downloaded porn contain violence against women. So, even in mainstream pornography, you have categories like rape, torture, things of that nature that normalize a sexual expression that is just ridiculously deviant compared to a generation or two past, right? So this kind of giving people the opportunity to see more and more crazy and more, I guess, a plurality of what were previously considered extremely taboo things to see, right? Part of it is just that there's a flood of these sexualized videos and images and people want to get theirs seen. They try and make it more and more and more extreme, just like how advertising has become more and more pornographic in a way to try to draw our attention and our eyeballs to what they're trying to sell us, right? They prey upon this kind of sexualized notions that have happened since the spread of technology, especially through the internet, has brought pornography to a whole different kind of audience, right? So again, I have some stats on here too of like just how many people face this kind of almost addiction when it comes to pornography, where they're almost unable to kind of function in a normal, not I guess normal, right? What was previously considered to be a normative sexual expression without the aid or use of pornography, right? So meaning that it kind of like has now taken over and shaped your desires. And so this is also kind of troubling because so many young people see their first, experiences of sexuality through pornography. That means pornography, just like media, then has an extreme ability to shape the attitudes and experiences of the sexuality of young people. Meaning if they see porn and they think that's what actual sex is, then that's going to shape their own experiences and desires and think that, they have to hyperperform this exaggerated, sadistic, demeaning form of sexuality. Or as the video clip I'll show you, this man refers to it as sex with no hands, right? Okay, so when it comes to pornography and violence, in 1985, the U.S. Attorney General's Commission on Pornography was formed, and they concluded that pornography increases people's sexual activity and encourages men to be more aggressive and more accepting of violent acts such as rape. So for people that view a lot of pornography, they tend to have higher rape myth acceptance, meaning that they tend to think, oh, women were asking for it, or no means yes, or that, all women just desire sex and they want to be conquered. It's like, because if you're seeing images of women who appear to be consenting to something that looks like sexual violence to the viewer, even though this person is in a power dynamic where they're often getting paid, though in fairness, so many people within the worlds of pornography are still also, there's a lot of victims of human trafficking that are also caught up in that world. So a lot of people, they often call it filmed prostitution, because it's that same kind of issue. Like, for all of the people that are paid well and doing well within the porn industry and make a lot of money for themselves, there's so many other people that are in these kind of like amateurish sites all over the world that really try to make money from the exploitation of a lot of young people that get actually sucked up into the system, not because they decide to do it as an agentic, like sexualized adult woman that's like, hey, I want to work in the sex industry. A lot of people get into it young as a result of human trafficking. So that's a whole nother issue, right? So then, and others claim that the evidence doesn't clearly support a link between pornography and rape. So obviously it's not as if you like watch something and then you immediately do it, right? It's more the idea that it softens your attitudes and understandings about it being wrong, right? So that you start to kind of, what would have been abhorrent to you now is like, nah, it's not that big of a deal. And that kind of leads to the preponderance of the fact that rape is such a epidemic issue within our culture. And that it happens to more and more young people, right? It's becoming younger as an issue in this culture. So the attitudes that people have in the culture of like, meh, not a big deal, does affect whether or not people get arrested, whether or not they're even charged with those crimes, whether they're prosecuted, whether they actually are sentenced, right? Or if it's like Brock Turner, even if they're sentenced, do they do more than 3 months, right? That sends a message to a lot of people that would commit those kind of crimes or consider that to be normative and okay, that really it's not a big deal if you only get a couple months for something, right? So again, it's not as if that it says like monkey see, monkey do, you just watch a video and then you actually go out and do that. It's just that it normalizes it, just as watching a lot of violence on television normalizes violence to us, that we don't see it as that bad. So I'm going to show you a clip really quick that kind of speaks to this, a little TED Talk.
I stopped watching porn for 2 reasons, basically. The first one was that porn brought so much anger and violence into my private fantasies. And these were anger and violence that were not there originally to begin with. And I did not want that for me anymore. This was not me, and I decided to just put an end to it. Easier said than done. I'll get to it later, but the second reason was that I came to realizing, I think, that only by watching porn, I take part in creating a demand for filmed prostitution, because that's what porn really is, filmed prostitution. Porna stands for prostitute, graphia stands for documentation, and prostitution was nobody's childhood dream, okay? That it is always a result of trouble and distress. Now, I became aware of that gradually when I was volunteering with men and women in prostitution, some of them victims of human traffic, serving aid in brothels, under the bridge, in street corners. But you don't really need to do all that in order to understand how this mechanism of porn and prostitution works. Because porn as a genre, it's not about erotica or healthy sexual communication. It is all about male domination of women, subordinance of women, not only as a sexual practice, as a way of being, as a genderial hierarchy in this world. Like if we would ask porn, if we were to ask porn, how does it define something as sexual? What qualifies, what defines something as sexual? Porn would laugh in our face. What defines sexual? Whatever men find arousing. Men find it arousing to choke a woman, to have brutal sex without one touch, hug, kiss, tender caress. Well, then it is sexual. It arouses men to see a woman or a child cry. It is sexual. It arouses men to rape a woman. Well, then it is sexual. In every mainstream porn gallery on the web, we can find the rape category, side by side with the humiliation category, abuse category, crying category, and so on. And this is all as if regular porn is not already filled with these motives. Even in its mildest version, the mildest version of porn, what porn is showing us, like, I don't know, 80, maybe 90% of the time, is actually sex with no hands involved. And this is not how we authentically desire. Sorry, I'll repeat that. I see your look. Sex with no hands involved. Okay. If you're not going to give up watching porn, so next time you do watch, just notice that porn cameras have no interest in capturing any normal sensual activities, such as petting, caressing, making out, touching, hugging, kissing. No. What porn cameras are into is the penetration. So normally, the composition will be a man and a woman, hopefully just one. Okay, so one man and one woman. His penis is inside her. Don't be picky. Doesn't matter where inside. Somewhere inside her there is a penis. His penis is somewhere inside her, okay? And in order to not block the camera for doing this extreme close-up on the penetration, he's standing with his hands behind his back most of the time. And the woman is in this uncomfortable position, and she needs to handle the penis inside her without damaging the hair or makeup work done on her, because that's money invested and time invested in her, without disturbing his aggressive movement, and mainly without blocking the camera. So the result is that we got two people having sex, different shapes and acrobatics or something, but they're having sex when the only body parts that actually touch each other are the penis and the part being penetrated. No hands involved. Now, I talk, I don't know, 250, 300 times a year. Soldiers, students, pupils. No one has ever come up to me and say, Ran, you know, that part with sex with no hand thing, that was my authentic desire. Like, when I was 11 or 12, I never wanted to kiss anybody or touch them. I was not curious about that. It was all penetrations to begin with. No one has ever said that. Before porn. After porn. In my private fantasies before watching porn, there was always a very strong narrative. And the narrative was of sensuality and mutuality, which means that I had always imagined what I will say to her. What would she possibly answer? What options do I have to respond? In real life, it never works like I planned, but it was super important in my mind in terms of arousal, the build-up, the location, the setting, where will it be? What are the circumstances of me and her being all alone all of a sudden? How will this bodily inflaming between us will emerge step by step? It was super important before porn. After making a habit out of porn, it conquers your mind and it invades your brain, and I lost my ability to imagine, which means I found myself, and I won't be too explicit, but trying to masturbate, just closing my eye, trying to fantasize desperately about something human and not making it, because my head was bombarded with all those images of women being violated and subordinated and forced into pretending they enjoy diabolic sperm rituals, okay? So this is pretty much the result. And we are all vulnerable to pornography. It's not just young people. And we should be very careful, I think, with not only what we put into our bodies, but in terms of food and nutrition, in what is the nutrition of our mind, because everything we watch invades us. I'll give you a short example from non-sexual areas. I came back home, and my beloved one was watching some cultural junk. She was watching a karaoke show, auditions, the one with the chairs spinning. And we don't have a TV set back home, okay? We don't have a TV set back home, but only because it allows us to falsely present ourselves as deep and profound people. Wait, I know, no, I never heard of that. Mastectomy, who? Angelina, no, we don't have a TV. We watch every cultural junk possible, okay? Not me, not her, we don't contemplate about l'existence. We download stuff, and we download all cultural junk. So I'm watching this 20 minutes karaoke show, and it was so boring and tedious, okay? 2 minutes talking, 4 minutes blabbering about it. I lost patience after like 20 minutes, and I went off to take a shower. And the most interesting part was in the shower, because what I found out there was myself in my most pathetic ever. I'm going to share it with you. I want to feel that you actually accept me and love me, so I have to share my most pathetic, and you have to accept it now. I don't know until I got over myself if it took me, 5, 7, 10 minutes to realize that I'm standing under the water in the shower, pondering severely what would have been my song for the auditions. Deep and profound, mind you. I won't be doing this Rihanna, Lady Gaga, I'll be doing Mercedes Sosa, Como un pájaro libre. I'll be doing a cover for Bob Dylan's Blind Willie McTell. Ain't that deep and profound? I had to realize that I'm an idiot because I have no talent for music. More than that, I never wanted to be neither a musician nor a singer-songwriter. This was never a part of my inner world of wishes. Okay, but I'm a human being. What can I do? I was watching that for 20 minutes. It entered my brain for a while. So if we take this example and we just try to measure or estimate the impact of 20 minutes of watching no matter what, how it invades our mind and conquer our wantings and desires, let's just try to imagine, or I can share with you orally, what is the impact of 20 minutes of watching porn once, twice a week, nothing unmoderated. It's overtaking. And porn is in our households whether we want it or not, and I believe that it does not agree with our well-being. And because we have internet in the Western world all over the place, almost in every cellular phone now, we've got 90% of 12-year-olds watching porn on a regular basis. And it has both an addictive effect and a paralyzing effect. It's addictive because we develop somewhat of a dependency in porn, but the paralyzing part is because, mainly for young boys and men, because porn is teaching us that as a man, you are solely valued in sex by having a large penis and an eternal erection. According to porn, being a valuable sexual partner does not relate with being sensual, passionate, attentive, generous, well-coordinated. None of the above. It is all about large penis and eternal sunshine, which we don't possess. So boys become paralyzed, and if they don't become paralyzed by watching porn, very often they turn into imitators of what they saw, which means they become aggressors. Aggressors, even when emotion is involved. Like, there is so much sexual abuse going on nowadays within the confines of what we perceive from the outside as beautiful teenage love stories or healthy adult relationships, because we don't really talk about sex. We just see it all over the place. We don't really talk about it. So what goes on in the confines of a certain room, but these are all sexual mutations that happens. If we talk about women, it's not only that, but young girls and women get the message, not only from hardcore porn, but from our porn-influenced mainstream culture. Have you seen any Miley Cyrus, Lady Gaga video clip, commercials? That's porn with clothes on it. So girls get this notion that if you want to be worthy of love, first and foremost, you have to be worthy of sexual desire. And now, the definition of sexual desire almost equals be like a porn star. So I work in dozens and dozens of high schools and junior highs. In every single one of these schools, I find girls that at a certain point agreed to be documented in an intimate situation because they wanted to please some guy that they had feelings for. And this guy misappropriated their trust. Always same story, so he sells it on WhatsApp application or on the web, in the internet. And normally nobody even addresses him in terms of moral. But it is always girls that suffer from shaming and mortification. They can change school, they drop out normally, change school, move to another city, and still be haunted on social networks. They develop clinical depressions, severe eating disorders, as if we don't have enough reasons in our culture to develop eating disorders. They become so isolated socially. So some of them, like Amanda Todd, rest in peace, some of them actually commit suicide because they find no more value in life or in themselves. So porn is not only in our house, it is a capital case. It is not a minor phenomenon in our society. It is a question of life and death sometimes. It is mainly a question of life and death for the people who participate in porn, because porn is not an embodiment of freedom of speech, freedom of occupation, blah, blah, blah. No, it's an embodiment of sex exploitation working side by side with human traffic, raping, pimping, solicitation. For every one porn star with a book contract or a production company, we've got hundreds of thousands of women and girls who does not survive out there. Literally, they just don't make it. The sex industry just, how do you say, chews them up and spits them back into brothels, into hooking in the street, escorting, massage parlors with happy or unhappy ending, depends who you ask. And I'm not joking, this is serious life. This is the whole spectrum of prostitution. So many of them doesn't even make it to the age of 50. I'm talking countries that the average life expectancy is 75, 76 years now. They don't make it to the age of 50, for reasons mainly. Drugs, STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, being murdered by a John, a pimp, a boyfriend. And the fourth reason is suicide once again. Because if you're a prostitute, on camera or off camera, you're in the situation that we can refer to as social death. We have all sat in the dinner table with people who probably consumed prostitution, that have been to a brothel once, twice, at least. We never sat down to the table with a prostitute, not with a declared one. So that's social death. It is not glamorous, not at all. And when I sit in the privacy of my room and I watch porn, even without paying, no need to pay, it's free, okay? I hope you know that, if you're still consuming. Whatever I am watching is creating a demand, and wherever there is a demand, there will be supply. There's a correlation. If I watch pornography of black older women, somebody is gonna go out and pimp black older women. Asian minors, somebody is already trafficking Asian minors in order to film them, okay? Israeli women, Palestinian women, WASP, all-American college girls, that are strong in the last few years, it's a very upcoming category. The scum of the earth are already out there trying to solicitate and prostitute these women on camera. So I stopped watching porn for my personal well-being, my intimate communication, my private erotic life, my, reclaiming control and responsibility over my mind. But by doing that, I actually stopped contributing to this horrible sex industry, and that's a good thing to do, I believe. And I would really like to propose that notion of physically and emotionally safe sex. Emotionally safe sex. It does not mean going back to be conservative or unliberated sexually. I'm all for sexual freedom. It just means that we need to put genderial hierarchy aside, subordinates aside, and bring back in, let's just say, laughter as a critical mass for intimacy. Two souls, two humans, two souls alone in private. Can they please have a laugh together? I don't care if they know each other for a decade or for an hour. If two souls alone in a room does not manage to have a laugh together, what good could possibly grow there, sexual and non-sexual? That's emotionally safe sex. I've got so many things I really want to share with you, but I feel like my time is almost up. So I just really want to ask for us to speak about these issues more, because I strongly feel that our history of silence never did us any good, because silence only perpetuates more silence, while talking normally gives birth to more talking, more sharing, more identification, more awareness, more change. Small change in our small, humble life, but real change, a true one, emotionally safer. Thank you for listening.
So sexual harassment is just any unwanted comments, gestures, or physical contact of a sexual nature. So the rise of the women's movement in the 1960s was primarily responsible for the definition of such behavior as a social problem. So in 1976, the federal court declared that sexual harassment amounted to illegal discrimination. And the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, or the EEOC, identifies two types of sexual harassment. First being quid pro quo, which means, basically an exchange. So either, you have to engage in some sort of relationship or sexual activity with a boss in order to keep your job, or maybe in order to get a promotion or something of that nature. Kind of an exchange of power. And then other one is just forms of behavior that create a hostile environment. So not just intent, but also effect is important here. So it's not necessarily just if the person who created the hostile work environment intended to do so, but it's the fact that they did create that environment that is important when it comes to legal understandings. So in 82% of sexual harassment cases, men harass women. So, that does show that there are a small percentage, but a decent chunk of men who are facing sexual harassment as well within the workforce. And so the Supreme Court in 1998 decided that employees can be victims of harassment even if they are not obviously harmed by those actions. And recent California changes are now protecting gender identity as a protected category through sexual harassment. So I put a picture down here of Anita Hill, and that's because I'm going to show you a brief clip about this. So she, her case got a lot of federal attention. A lot of people, this was kind of the turning point for the third wave of the women's rights movement to really address these issues of sexual harassment, was when Clarence Thomas was nominated to the Supreme Court. And Anita Hill, who was one of his former employees, came out and said that she had experienced sexual harassment as a result of working for him. And at first, Congress wouldn't even hear her testimony in relation to his nomination. And so the women within the Senate, basically did everything that they could and within the House to bring attention to the issue and forced the men to consider her testimony. So they did admit her testimony, but instead they put her on trial and they acted like she did something wrong, and they questioned her in very inappropriate and ridiculous kind of ways. She referred to the kind of harassment that she received actually ironically at the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So meaning the group that's supposed to oversee sexual harassment is the place where she got sexually harassed. So basically Clarence Thomas did some very egregious stuff, which, if you watch the film that is on Netflix, that this documentary clip is from, or that the trailer is from, you can see this for yourself. But he egregious stuff, right? Like he would talk about the size of his penis. He put pubic hairs on a can of her soda. He referred to himself as Long Dong Silver. Like, these are things you cannot make up. It's so ridiculous, right? So basically she goes and testifies in front of, this all-male panel, and turns out that he's still nominated to the Supreme Court anyway, and now Clarence Thomas has a spot until he dies. So now he is able to then make decisions on what actual sexual harassment cases come before him. So anyway, I'm going to show you this quick clip so that you get a little bit of this insight, and I highly suggest you watch the film for a better understanding of, this larger issue of sexual harassment and the kind of scorn that Anita Hill faced.
Knows about Anita Hill.
The sexual harassment storm around Clarence Thomas is intensifying.
I trust that the Senate will confirm this able man promptly.
Once I get subpoenaed, I knew what I had to do. I'm going to tell what happened to me.
She had no idea that she was walking into the political lion's den.
You swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. I can only imagine how difficult it must have been with her testifying.
It was unusual in how graphic the details were.
He measured his penis in terms of length.
And strange.
The name that was referred to was Long Dong Silver.
I think they were trying to trip her up.
I was on trial.
I've got statements from people that know her saying, watch out for this woman.
The issue became my character.
It didn't occur to her that an opposition campaign would be waged.
Bomb threats, my house, sexual violence.
Why would someone make up this story?
This wasn't about the truth. They were humiliating her.
This hearing is a circus, a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks.
They didn't want to appear to be going after a black man who said, I didn't do it.
These conversations, did he say, I have great physical capability and attributes, or was he more graphic?
He was much more graphic.
There were a lot of facts that they didn't want the public to know.
This is an important issue, and the dialogue should not stop here.
To any victim of sexual harassment, the message is nobody's going to take you seriously, not even the United States Senate.
You are not drawing a conclusion that Judge Thomas sexually harassed you.
Yes, I am drawing that conclusion. That
Well,
is
then I
my...
don't understand.
Well, let me try to explain again.
Okay, so prostitution is just the selling of sexual services. It is most common in low-income nations because oftentimes women in low-income nations have low status. So there's very few jobs that they're able to, get a hold of because since they have lower status, they have lower ability to get into the job market. So that's, kind of more common. Most sex workers are women and they range from escorts to streetwalkers. In the U.S., 2/3 of arrests are for prostitution are of women. The remaining men are both prostitutes and clients. So it's interesting that we make the issue of prostitution illegal for the person that is selling their sexual services, while in places like Sweden, they allow people to sell sex, but they make it a crime to buy sex, meaning that you put the actual legal ramifications on the person who is buying sex, who, again, a lot of these women, especially, again, looking at it from a context of low-income nations, a lot of women that just really have no other way to financially support themselves. Not just that, but also like the picture I have down here, there's a ton of women that are caught into this kind of global net of prostitution that are actual victims of what we call sex slavery or human trafficking, right? Where sometimes they're manipulated into these contracts at a young age. They're promised, work that is not sex work. And then they are taken from their homes, they're taken from their support systems, and then they end up in a different place, completely out of control of their own, lives, their own money, their own resources. And ultimately, they are forced to engage in prostitution, but give that money over to someone else, right? Even women that work on the street, kind of outside of this system of human trafficking, are still often subjected to the violence of pimps and others that control them and control the money that they make. So, this is kind of a larger issue. Like when we talk about prostitution, we also have to kind of mention how much, there's the sex trade, and like we'll talk about in a moment, sex tourism. So for desperately poor children, selling sex is a means of survival. So, worldwide, sex tourism is on the rise, with the greatest increase in Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. And in patriarchal societies, poor girls are sent out of the home to work, and they may end up in the sex trade. So kind of like what I was talking about before, a lot of these women get caught up in a net. There's actually a lot of this money that comes in to these industries so that they can continue comes from our Western dollars, of people traveling to other countries to have sex with children. The average age of some of these prostitutes is incredibly young, about 9 years old as an average. So you have like this picture right here, Somali Nam. I'm going to show you a little clip about her, and I put the little thing over here from Half the Sky, a film that I show in another class. Basically, it's a book and also a film, and I'm going to show you a little clip of it about the experiences of some of these young people in the picture here. They are all young girls that were rescued from brothels. So these girls, even though they're extremely young, were subjected to sex for money as part of the sex tourism industry. So this woman here, she basically had escaped a brothel herself when she was young, and so she has kind of almost built like a refuge for women that have gone through this process because they are scorned socially. So it basically makes it so that they're not really often accepted back into their families and into their communities. So she's kind of giving them a place where they receive love and attention and education, and also training them to become kind of activists of a sort that help, change public opinions towards brothels and help get other girls out of brothels. So I'm going to show you a quick clip of that as well. But for more info about it, you can watch the whole film on YouTube. I think it's like a couple bucks, or Amazon Prime. So I highly suggest it. It's a great, great film, but also a book that you can get a hold of, Half the Sky.
We're off to meet the absolutely amazing Somali man, who is one of my heroes and just the most incredible woman. And every time I meet her, she speaks better English, which is her fourth language.
Her fourth language?
Her fourth language.
Phnom Penh has a kind of a year zero energy still. It really feels like the Wild West, frankly. And there are these kind of waves of sadness that run through it, and they kind of lift you up like a tide and push you back down and lift you up, and they're arbitrary. They seem to waft through it.
One of the reasons why you have so much trafficking here is because the war just blew apart the country. You had a lot of generals with guns. You had peacekeepers who had money and were buying sex from girls, so that certainly peacekeepers
Nice.
and foreign aid workers, and that all contributed to it.
So, Somali mom, who we're going to see right now, she was trafficked as a child.
She was trafficked as a very young girl, I think about age 12. She was brutally mistreated by these brothels. Saw her best friend murdered by a brothel owner. She managed to escape and then started her organization to help rescue other girls. And because she has that background, she has the street credibility with these girls, they just love her. Hey!
Hello!
How are you?
Great to see you.
How are you?
Really good.
Great, we're excited.
I want you to meet Meg.
How are you?
Great. Hello, how are you?
I'm good. I'm
These are
good. I'm great.
amazing
I'm
people.
so happy to have you here. Welcome to my house.
I'm so delighted.
Somali is one of those charismatic people who you are thrown up into the air with how impressed you are with their heroism and their dedication and their grace. And she's everything all at once.
So, Somali, not only do you rescue these girls, you have centers where you rehabilitate them, educate them, and that's your life's work.
That's my life. I think I cannot live without that. That is my life because I help them, but they help me. We help each other, I think.
Don't you think the situation is better now in Cambodia, though, than, say, a decade ago?
It's not easy to talk like this because before in my age, it's like 12, 14, 13, Right now, you can see my girl. You're going to see 3 years old, have been sold in the brothel, 5 years old. So the age is going more and more down because if she's 12 or 14, she's too old already.
And you rescue girls from brothels. How does that work? What happens on the day that you go in and say this? You'll save this one or that one.
You may see, because we may do a raid on the Thai border in a few days. There's a young girl being held in the brothel.
She's 14, so right now we make the file complaint. We go to the police.
Do you go alone?
Sometimes I go by my own because it's so dangerous. It's military. It's so dangerous. You cannot. Our team cannot go inside because of the risk of their life.
Well, you're incredibly brave.
Thank you. We always say we try our best because you love us. We have nothing to give you back. We have no money. We have nothing. We just want to be the good person, helping others, helping ourselves to show you that we are survivors. We are from the brothel. We are from the darkness because in Cambodia, I think everywhere when you are prostitute, they treat you very badly. So we just want to show the people around the world and the people, like we have also dignity. That is survivor. Đừng có nào khi đến vui thì cứ nói hiện
Somali was talking right before the girls came in about the darkness, which I think is her way of saying anything that has happened to any of these girls in the past. And the only way to heal the darkness in any of them is drop by drop. Love, affection, continuously. Love, affection. The fact that they all feel safe enough to seek affection, that they have one another for it, that is a pretty amazing amount of healing she's been able to accomplish with them. So each of their little hugs is such a success.
Sraipo had been sold when she was 7 years old by her own mother. So helping her, she go back to the brothel. Helping her, she go back. She make me my hair like very white because of her.
13 ឆ្នាំ ពេលខ្ញុំនៅផ្ទះបងខ្ញុំធ្វើគេវាយធ្វើបាបពួកគាត់មកខ្ញុំទទួលភ្ញៀវពេល8 ឆ្នាំដែលខ្ញុំរស់នៅក្នុងផ្ទះបង
The girls and me, we are the same. Because we are the same life. I'm them, they are me. One day, a man come to my village. I was maybe 10, 11. And he tell me that he going to help me to find my family, to find my mother and my father. I was so happy. But later, when I live with him, I look at his eyes and I feel that I make a big mistake.
You the story. Yeah, when we share our story to you, we want to ask you, how do you feel after that?
After see us.
Yeah, after see us.
It's a very, very powerful thing to tell your story, to say personally what happened to you, for anyone. You all have been through what you've been through and are so dignified now, and all of you so beautiful.
Yeah.
It's very far from my experience, and to see that you have come out and are able to tell your stories in such a dignified way is very moving.
Somali and her organization, AFSI, are intended to help girls who are rescued from the brothels, and then they emerge as these remarkable young women who are still rejected by their families and by societies because they have this past in a brothel, but are amazingly talented. And they emulate Somali. They want to be like her. And so she's created a little army of these Voices of Change girls.
Hi, សប្តាហ៍ថ្ងៃនេះគឺពួកនាងខ្ញុំទាំងអស់គ្នានឹងគឺធ្វើការនៅមូលនិធិសមរីម៉មផ្នែក Voice of Change គឺសម្លេងដើម្បីមានការផ្លាស់ប្ដូរចាថ្ងៃនេះសប្បាយចិត្តខ្លាំងមែនតើដែលបានខ្ញុំមកជួបជុំជាមួយពូទាំងអស់គ្នាដែលមានពូនៅខាងតុកតុកនៅខាងម៉ូតូដូបនៅខាងប៉ូលីសលើពូទាំងអស់គ្នាស្គាល់នេះអត់ស្គាល់ហើយគេអូខេបង្ហាញមកខាងនេះផងអានេះអូខេសម្រាប់អីគេអូខេសម្រាប់អីគេការពីកុំឲ្យអីខ្លះកុំឲ្យឆ្លងរោគអ្វីទៀតឆ្លងរោគរូបមិនទៀតរអីខ្លះរោគអេដរូបនឹងស្វាយចាចឹងទៅពីមុខនេះអញ្ចឹងពូអញ្ជើញមើលពេលដែលយើងមុននឹងហែកយើងទាញវាមកមួយចំហៀងចាគឺទាញវាបែបនេះចា
One of the girls who has meant the most to Cheryl and me here in Cambodia is Long Pras, the little broken, shattered girl who had had her eye gouged out by a brothel owner. She has renamed herself Samana, which means forgiveness, and she is assertive. She goes out and tells men not to patronize brothels. She has truly just flowered into something that I would never have thought possible. Samana, you were really good.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
were really good.
Thank you so much.
So why did you choose the name Samana? It means forgiveness, right?
ថាពេលដែលខ្ញុំខ្លាចជាជនរងគ្រោះហើយគ្មានអ្នកណាគេលើកលែងទោសឲ្យគេតែងតែនិយាយថាស្រីខូចចាអញ្ចឹងបើសិនជានៅមានពាក្យហ្នឹងខ្ញុំមិនអាចរស់បានទេពួកអីទៅណាក៏គេនិយាយអញ្ចឹងទៅណាក៏គេនិយាយអញ្ចឹងគ្មានសេចក្តីស្រឡាញ់ប៉ុន្តែខ្ញុំអត់ខឹងគេទេប៉ុន្តែខ្ញុំនឹងក្រោកឈរឡើងដើម្បីជួយស្ត្រីផ្សេងៗទៀតកុំឲ្យ I think so ចំពោះថ្ងៃនេះនេះខ្ញុំបានទៅទីតាំងយកក្មេងនៅតាមផ្ទះបនដែលគាត់ចង់មកពិនិត្យសុខភាពពេលទៅពួកខ្ញុំក៏បាននិយាយចែកពីប្រវត្តិរបស់ពួកខ្ញុំថាពួកខ្ញុំពីមុនក៏ខ្ញុំអញ្ចឹងដែរអញ្ចឹងមិនចាំបាច់ខ្លាចទេជាមិត្តភក្តិរបស់មនុស្សម្នាក់មនុស្សនៅភូមិរបស់ខ្ញុំចឹងឯសារឃើញគ្រួសារខ្ញុំខកពេកគាត់ក៏សួរខ្ញុំថាចង់ទៅធ្វើការនៅភ្នំពេញអត់អញ្ចឹងខ្ញុំក៏ប្រាប់គាត់ថាខ្ញុំចង់កាលនោះខ្ញុំទៅអាយុ13ឆ្នាំហើយគាត់បាននិយាយថានឹងជាផ្ទះម្ដាយមីងរបស់គាត់ពេលដែលគេនិយាយរួចហើយគេពេលគេថាលោកឲ្យគេអញ្ចឹងខ្ញុំភ័យខ្ញុំទាទៅវិញយ៉ាងណាគេមកឲ្យទៅហើយគេក៏យកខ្ញុំទៅចាក់សោនៅផ្ទុកខំដីពេលហើយគេថាទុកពេលឲ្យមួយអាទិត្យដើម្បីសម្រាប់ចិត្តទទួលភ្ញៀវខ្ញុំអត់ព្រមទទួលភ្ញៀវគេក៏វាយហើយគេឆក់ខ្សែភ្លើងហើយគេអត់ឲ្យបាយញ៉ាំទេហើយគេនៅឲ្យខ្ញុំទទួលភ្ញៀវរាល់ថ្ងៃមួយថ្ងៃខ្ញុំនៅក្មេង10 20នាក់30នាក់ពេលនឹងពួកអីគេទៅគេតែប្រើស្រោមហើយវាក៏ខ្ញុំមានផ្ទៃពោះពេលយកកូននឹងចេញហើយចេញវាហូរឈាមហើយវាឈឺចាប់ពេកនៅឯបងនៅឯលើទៅមួយថ្ងៃទៅបានចូលហើយបានចូលបងផ្នែកកំណើតផ្នែកបងនេះមេបនចាក់ចូលទៅបនតាំងពីអាយុ13ឆ្នាំដឹងបានទេបងអត់ទេអត់មានដឹងគេបានចាប់គេក៏អត់បានដែរគេរត់បានចាបើខ្ញុំវិញទាញក្បត់ចាក់ថ្ងៃវិញហ្មងហើយពេលត្រូវចេញភ្លាមនឹងចាក់ត្រូវភ្លាមថ្ងៃមកពេទ្យមែនអត់ទេគេឲ្យបងមកឯងគេទុកបងចោលនៅនឹងទុកតួបងហូរឈាមយ៉ាងណាក៏គេនៅតែឲ្យបងទទួលភ្ញៀវដែរហើយធម្មតាអូនឯងនឹងស្រាប់ឲ្យភ្ញៀវស្វឹងមិនក៏គេទៅរួចវាមិនខកពីយើងឈឺហូរឈាមអីមែនទេពេលបានប៉ូលីសចុះទៅប៉ូលីសគេសើទៅគេចុះទៅគេចាប់មកគេចាប់បងមកក៏គេយកបងមកដាក់នៅហើយខ្វេះគ្រប់ភ្នែកយើងចេញដល់បងមកហ្នឹងហើយទៅពេលយើងទៅគេក៏ខ្វេះគ្រប់ភ្នែកចេញហើយជឿអីឪពុកម្ដាយរបស់យើងដល់គាត់ឈប់ស្រឡាញ់យើងឯងគាត់លែងស្រឡាញ់យើងដោយសារតែយើងមកវិញយើងអត់មានគ្រប់លក្ខណៈឯងហើយយើងសំគួរអាណិតកូនយំគិតមកអត់ដឹងអត់ទេខ្ញុំនិយាយមែន I don't know talk sorry I'm
So all this area on Longway is Khmer Rouge before.
I see.
It's still dangerous. I was in there because I knew that a lot of the girls have been removed to Longway and to Thai border to reserve the soldier because the soldier they need, you know, the men they need the women. And that
Somali will periodically stage a raid on a brothel with the help of the anti-trafficking police. That has to start with intelligence about a young girl being kept inside a brothel.
So this girl, she's Vietnamese. When I talk to her, I feel that she had been like trafficked.
How old is she?
She told me that she's 14.
I mean, she looks very young. She looks very young, too, for that
A
matter.
lot of the girl having there is very young. So
Smalley went into her brothel pretending to have some military connections. She wore army fatigues and chatted with the girl. She took photos and then presented that intelligence on, obviously, underage girls being held.
She have to have like 10, 12 clients a day. If she don't want it, they beating her.
Well, it certainly sounds like she's trafficked.
She's there like 3 months, I mean like 30 years for her.
And the reason that you only work with anti-trafficking police is that presumably they aren't taking bribes from the traffickers. Well, if you told the local police,
Not
they
the
would.
local. The local, it's impossible.
I remember when I've been here in Phnom Penh in the past, there was a raid, and you brought the girls back to your shelter, and then
They come to the center, yeah.
then the brothels raided your shelter and took the girls back. And you've had the traffickers hold a gun to your head.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're going to take their own money. The girl is their money. So you bring the girl, of course they're not happy with you.
Okay, so the rate of teen pregnancy in the US is decreasing, but it's still higher than most other high-income countries, right? So we're at 3% there, but you can see, you know, the UK, Canada, Sweden, Japan have much lower rates, and then countries that have more poverty are a bit higher. So when it comes to teenage pregnancy, of all pregnant teens, most are not married, 17% have miscarriages, 25% have abortions, and just under 60% keep their babies. So teenage pregnancy is more common among poor families and most common among poor African American girls. So becoming pregnant as a teen dramatically increases the odds of remaining poor. So again, it's this idea that you don't become poor, you remain poor. So like if you've watched Teen Mom, you know, a lot of these girls are affluent girls, so they don't become poor. But you can see the barriers that they do face if you watch the show, which I love. I can't help myself. If you watch the show, you know that they do face barriers to continuing their education because it's very difficult to go through your education as a teen mother to get a job. You know, those kind of things are much more difficult. So if you're already poor when you have that child, the odds of remaining poor are, you know, basically the odds are stacked against you. Teenage pregnancy costs the taxpayers $11 billion a year. But the highest cost is to the babies because babies that are born to teens that are pregnant have lower birth weights. And because their birth weights are lower, they have a higher risk of physical and developmental problems. So many face poor nutrition, little schooling, and inadequate health care. And some grow up at high risk of becoming single parents themselves. So this is obviously connected to sex education because critics say that the level of sexual activity has increased you know, with the adoption of sex education, so that like, oh, we shouldn't teach teens about sex because then they'll have sex. But supporters say the biggest cause of teen pregnancy is ignorance, right? At least if we teach teens about sex and safe sex, then they can choose whether or not to participate in those activities, right? Versus if you just say, well, don't teach them about it at all. We actually saw that when we promoted nationally an agenda through, you know, the Bush administration of abstinence-only sex education training. Of course, in California, we didn't have that, but this kind of abstinence-only sex education training as federally funded, you saw an actual rise in the amount of teen pregnancies during that time period, meaning that the less information you're given about safe sex, the less you understand of how to do it yourself. So, of course, giving, you know, kind of comprehensive sex education gives, you know, young people the knowledge and information, not just to avoid unwanted pregnancies, but to avoid STDs and kind of other infections that could lead to a lot of problems. So abortion is the intentional termination of a pregnancy. There are 1.2 million abortions performed annually in the US, and about a quarter of all pregnancies end in abortion. So 85% of women who undergo the procedure are unmarried. Half have an income below or close to the poverty line. So, you know, kind of, again, looking at the demographics there of who is going through this. People unmarried who are poor, Most are in their 20s, and about half have had at least one abortion already. So again, this is a super controversial topic in our culture, but in the US, from the colonial era to the mid-19th century, early-term abortion was legal everywhere, right? It wasn't until the early 20th century that laws banning abortion were enacted in every state. So again, we think of this as like something that's always been illegal or always been a thing, and then it just became a right for women in 1973 to get abortions, actually from the colonial era to the mid, 1800s. Early-term abortion was legal everywhere. So it's interesting how it becomes this topic that we think, because since the 1980s there's been quite a conservative backlash against laws that allow women to control their own body. So there's been a lot of state decisions about these things, and it remains a very controversial issue. And basically there was another case that in the 90s that gave states the ability to put restrictions on abortion. So now you see so many different states that try and say, like, you have to have a parental permission, you have to listen to an ultrasound of a baby's heartbeat and then wait 48 hours before you can have it, or all sorts of like kind of weird, messed up criteria. Basically, and they say it's in the interest of providing women health, but really it's kind of a way to psychologically torture them and make them feel bad about their decision when, the people that are implementing these laws aren't actually stepping in these girls' shoes and trying to understand why they're doing what they're doing. So for example, putting in a law that says that you have to have a parental consent for an abortion if you're under 18 makes sense in theory to people that aren't going through those situations, right? So in theory, it makes sense, like, okay, well, you should talk to your parents and obviously have some relationship with them to explain, like, hey, I'm pregnant, blah, 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 and use them as a social support, obviously. But in reality, I teach family violence, so it's one of those things that most people don't like to talk about, but in reality, a lot of people that are facing sexual assault or rape are facing it within their own family. So what if your, adult person, whether it's a grandparent, uncle, parent, is the person who's abusing you? Are they going to sign off on that abortion? Are you going to ask them to? Right? So again, from a legislative place, from a privileged place where people don't experience these kind of things, it's easy to just say, well, there should be restrictions. But when you're actually coming from the perspective of those marginalized few people that really need those restrictions to not be in place, or that they are going to be stuck, with an unwanted pregnancy that is often the result of sexual assault or worse, it's important to kind of understand what they're going through before we legislate on their behalf, right? So again, Texas did this recently too, where they tried to make it so that, if you had a clinic, it had to have hospital admitting privileges and have the same equipment as a hospital, put all of these restrictions on it in order to close down all but 2 clinics within the entire state. So people had to drive over 200 miles in one direction just to be able to get care. So this is still an issue. And, actually the most repressive laws that try to control abortion, who can get it, who can access it, how it's done, when it's done, have actually happened since 2010 on. So it's a pretty recent issue. When it comes to STDs, obviously these are diseases that are spread by sexual contact. There's more than 50 kinds of STDs or STIs, including gonorrhea, syphilis, herpes, all the ones you've seen those weird commercials for. There's 20 million new sexually transmitted infections each year, and half of those infected are under age 25. So this is an important topic within a college course, right? So the cost of treatment to taxpayers is about $16 billion a year. So it is definitely a social problem. So we're going to talk about a few of those specific ones in a moment. So when it comes to AIDS, right? First, this is caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, right? HIV, which destroys the body's immune system. So a lot of the ways that people die by getting this disease is really like pneumonia or something of that nature, but then the body is unable to fight it because the immune system has been damaged by HIV. So a trend in reporting cases and deaths in the US is decreasing. There were 15,529 deaths in 2010 and 32,050 new cases in 2011. So there's a total of 1.2 million people who have contracted AIDS, and 636,000 of which have died. Globally, 35 million people are infected, and 3.2 million of whom are children who were born to someone who was infected themselves. This is a gendered issue as well because it affects women more than men, and it's definitely a kind of globalized issue as sub-Saharan Africa accounts for 71% of the world's cases. So if you look at the situations there, why in sub-Saharan Africa? Well, the rights and status of women means that they are not allowed to use contraception or birth control or abortion or things of that nature. So people that get infected with these diseases, oftentimes it's because their partner has been unfaithful and they have really no choice in the matter. So they get infected and then they end up having children again, have no choice in the matter. So girls are, again, at a higher risk than boys just because of anatomy. And HIV is infectious, but it's not contagious in the same kind of easy way. Like it has to be through, sex, through sharing needles when using drugs, those kind of things. So when it comes to AIDS, again, the US government was pretty slow to respond to the AIDS crisis. The disease was socially constructed in the early years to be considered a homosexual disease. Because of the fact that disease disproportionately affected gay men, this resulted in a slow response from the government to deal with the spread of HIV and AIDS. So meaning that if it would have been seen as a public health crisis, they could have put in a lot of resources into it in the first place to try and deal with not spreading these issues. But the fact that it was largely gay men and IV drug users that were considered to be the only targets of the disease, it wasn't taken seriously. And this was during the Reagan era where it was just kind of ignored for a few years. In the early years when you could really intervened and stopped it from becoming an epidemic. So it was not given serious attention until the epidemic spread into the heterosexual population. Then it was a problem. And that's why, it's still an ongoing issue that could have been addressed in the early 80s. So antiretroviral therapy improves the health of people with HIV and reduces transmission. So there are drugs that if you have it, you can take, and your partner would also take another drug as well to suppress the ability for you to spread this through sexual contact. So you can live with the disease. There's a lot of people that are somewhat prominent like Magic Johnson that are living with the disease. But there's a lot of medications and costs that go with that. All right, when it comes to how different theories look at this, structural functional analysis is looking at controlling sexuality. So they're emphasizing the importance of cultural norms in guiding our sexuality, and explaining why societies have always paid attention to who reproduces with whom. So, for example, all societies, even though there's very few like all this or all societies kind of things like universals, all societies observe incest to be a taboo. But traditional norms tend to favor legitimate offspring in many cultures. So when it comes to criticisms of this, though, this ignores gender, the diversity of sexual norms, and the changing patterns of sexual behavior. Okay, so then looking at symbolic interactionists and how they really are just trying to understand and define sexuality. So they highlight the variable meanings that people attach to sexuality. So such as the meanings of virginity, right? What is the cultural context for those kind of meanings? How we learn sexual roles and sexual scripts about what is appropriate behavior for a man, what is appropriate behavior for a woman, what sex is supposed to be, which again is this very heteronormative ideal. And of course, people socially construct sexuality just as they create the rest of the reality that they experience. So when it comes to the criticisms, though, is that some of the patterns when it comes to meanings of sexuality are pretty consistent. As much as sexual definitions were definitely affected by the Victorian era, a lot of the meanings that were attached during that time period, like especially in the late 1800s, are still kind of the core of our social understandings about appropriate sexuality. So it's interesting, some of them do endure a bit. So social conflict analysis is really taking into account feminist theory and queer theory. So feminist theory is looking at how, in this context of sexuality, women are seen in the culture largely as sexual objects, right? They're not subjects, meaning that they aren't the doers of the action, they are receivers, right? It's this idea that they are passive and that their sexuality doesn't actually matter. It's how they are available to men that matters, right? So that really kind of makes someone an object instead of a subject. They become a thing instead of a person. So, that's again the cultural kind of definition of the sexual roles come to define that. So, there's also this issue of violence as a manifestation of male dominance. Within sexuality, within pornography, there's quite a bit of imagery and, messages of violence against women as normative, as sexually arousing, right? Something that I think I pointed out earlier about how within the culture, it is somewhat normative for men to come in contact with or see through pornography or whatever it is, some normalization of the idea of violence against women as sexually appealing, right? But we have no cultural context for women to get turned on by seeing men get hurt. But we do have a cultural context where lots of men get turned on by watching women get hurt. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon that, of course, goes along with, just those structured differences in power from a social conflict perspective of, different status in society means that you aren't valued as much, so you're not considered as much of a person. So therefore, if you have less of a personhood, it is easier to justify violence against you, right? So anyway, that's kind of part of the way that they're looking at that. And of course, queer theory is going to challenge that heterosexual bias in our society that says that, the only kind of sexuality that's normative or acceptable culturally is heterosexual sex. When, there's a lot of stigma against, same-sex sexuality when it pertains to men, but a lot of men watch women have sex with each other. Because again, it goes back to that objectification situation of seeing women as there for their consumption, which is super ironic in the context of the fact that, if it's two women that are lesbians having sex with each other, that is literally the definition of you're not needed. So it's really interesting that, like, from the male gaze, there's still this sexualizing of same-sex relationships between women, but vilification and stigma against same-sex relations between men. So it's interesting how that kind of, again, is influenced by just the culture. All right, so then when it comes to how different political groups and society understand these things, and again, these things are important to understand too, kind of how our culture will either kind of adapt or often reify over and over these kind of specific cultural scripts about what is acceptable. So for conservatives, they support, conventional norms. They believe that premarital sex and extramarital sex are social problems that can lead to things like STDs or teen pregnancy. So, they believe that kind of, you should be a virgin until you're married. They condemn prostitution and pornography because they violate the traditional standards of decency, and they consider them to be something that threatens marriages. They also oppose abortion on demand because, they think that that's going to give one person the power to end the life of another person. So overall, the conservative answer to sexual social problems is a strong family life, which of course, in fairness is very racialized and class-based, right? We're not talking every family, we're talking ideally a, upper middle class or a wealthier white heteronormative family. So, that becomes the kind of archetype that all other families are compared to, whether or not they have the same class privilege or racial privilege. When it comes to how liberals look at the issues of sexuality in society, they often look at individual choice, meaning that they think that all people should have considerable choice in how they express their sexuality. So their attitude is basically one of tolerance, right? They believe as long as adults are consenting, that they should feel free to express their sexuality, right? So there is some limit to this liberal tolerance, often when someone is threatened with harm. So when it comes to exploitation, liberals aren't okay with those kind of sexual experiences, such as sex tourism or the global sex trade, which, I showed you that video about earlier, and just how harmful those can be, especially these kind of cycles of human trafficking and all of these horrible things. So they often, as liberals do, that's kind of the definition of liberals, they look to the government to address social problems, right? The whole point of liberalism is this idea of changing the structure of the government to favor, progressive or quote unquote ideas. So, they think that the government needs to, have protections, offer legal, I guess, protections for people to either, be free from the kind of exploitive nature of human trafficking, while on the other hand, have protection to be able to express their sexuality without any fear of imprisonment or violence or things of that nature. So they support abortion as something that should be available to all people, leaving the decision up to the woman involved and her doctor, and not up to people that sit in Congress that tend to be white dude millionaires or billionaires. And so the radical lefts, when they try and understand these things, of these issues that go on in our culture when it relates to sexuality, they say, let's just go to the root of the problem. So they argue that sexual social problems are a dimension of the overall general social inequality. So they come about because one category of people in society has so much more power over the other, right? This kind of binary idea of man and woman, that social construct has come to privilege one group and oppress another. So as there's an unequal distribution of power, that means, that's a dimension of that larger social inequality. So radicals, on the left, encourage women to work together to achieve political aims and to avoid dependency on men, right? And I have this little crime thing poster here on the right that kind of talks about this, the constraining nature, or just, hints at this issue of gender not just being something that's repressive and exploitive towards women, but also something that's repressive and exploitive towards men, right? So this idea, for every girl who's tired of acting weak when she is strong, there's a boy tired of appearing strong when he feels vulnerable. So this kind of flip of the coin, these constructs are not anything that's kind of coming from our own natural desires of expression. They come from the societal pressure to conform to these, this binary idea of you are this or you are that. And there's certain norms constructed about those behaviors. So that doesn't actually comport with our actual lived realities, but unfortunately, society does a good job of telling us that we are the anomaly and that everyone else seems to get it but us, so that we have to conform. So, they really say that if we don't deal with these gender issues, then we're always going to have these kind of larger issues of inequality. All right, so that is chapter 7.